Okay, so I've used the template to draw out my rabbit, and now I'm ready to color him. I've drawn this onto 220 gram watercolor paper. This is a treeless paper, so it's cotton instead of cellulose, and I'm just going to make a lovely little rabbit. I'm going to start off the nose, which I'm going to use quite a lot of pigment for. Now I've traced him in pencil, and that's really helpful because the pencil can be erased later on. Let's see, I guess I'll make a traditional brown rabbit. Let's make a traditional brown rabbit. Just fill in some color here. And I want to make sure that the only hard edges are along the pencil line there. So wherever there's a hard edge in the center of my painting, I want to get rid of that. If I just leave this here, this will become a hard edge. I don't want that. I want the hard edges along the pencil lines there, and only along the pencil lines. Okay, now that I've got water all along the part that I want color on, I'm going to go through and actually put a bit more pigment on. So now the pigment's going to stay exactly where I want it to go. And I just want to give them a bit more color so it's not too dull. A dull rabbit. I'm doing all this work for a dull rabbit. On a brightly colored rabbit. And I might go back later and put a bit of texture in as well. Here we are. Again, getting that hard edge only on the one side. And then pulling that pigment through using the water. There we go. Again, I'm going to put a little bit more pigment on. These paints I'm using are primarily, what are they called? Rembrandt watercolor, artist watercolor paints. With a little bit of, I think I have some Winsor Newton thrown in because it's hard to get them anymore in Hong Kong. So next I'm going to do his head. This is the nose bridge and the forehead. The paint goes across the paper quite well, and this paper isn't bad. It's a pretty good paper, considering. It's not the nicest 100% cotton paper that you can get, but it's not cellulose either. Cellulose paper is made from trees and it just creates hard edges all over the shop. Almost all hard edges. It's not very nice to work with. Okay, let's see what else I can add in here. You get a bit of Paynes Grey in there. There we go. Add a little bit of Paynes Grey in it to give it a little bit of differentiation. Now, if I don't want a totally smooth rabbit, I want him to be a bit furry, I might even add a little bit of furry details in here. Like that. Makes him look a little bit more disreputable. Yeah. Don't want my rabbits to be too reputable. And you'll notice that in my palette, I actually have another, it's mostly just dots of paint because I've been preparing kits, and this is one of my palettes that I use to prepare the kits and just see how much paint I need to paint each one, so that I can make sure when I put the kit in, or when I put the kit together rather, there's going to be enough paint in it for the project that I'm proposing. Oh yeah, the disreputableness there. Love it. Love it. Okay. Now, so you'll notice that I have a color dot here from HKcolourlab, which is a really fantastic watercolor paint, and she makes acrylic inks as well here in Hong Kong. She's amazing, this lady who makes them. Her name is Shan, and she's been making this just beautiful iridescent mica-filled paint, which I've been using for a couple of years now on various different things that I do, especially the dragons that I like to make. And she's just recently agreed to give me some watercolor dots for the kits that I've been making, the guided watercolor kits that I've been making. So she's given me these beautiful dot cards, which have an incredibly generous amount of gold paint on them. But I'm saving the gold paint until I've put a base color of paint on the bottom of the rabbit, because although I could paint the whole rabbit in gold, I don't want to. I want to save the gold for a couple of really like shouty highlights, and I think that'll be really fun for it. Put those ears in there before I forget them. It's a good idea too, I've just done the exact opposite down here, but it's a good idea to let the paint that you're painting next to dry before you go and paint next to it again, because if I was to do this before this dries, it will just bleed through very, very quickly. So the brown and the pink would actually join in together, and it wouldn't be as good. It's another reason for using cotton paper is it absorbs and dries much more quickly than the cellulose paper. Cellulose paper, the paint sits on the top of it and it doesn't dry as quickly, and so it's not quite as good. We activate some of this and a little bit more of that Paynes Grey in there. I really like that texture. That gives that, look at that lovely bit up there. Okay, so I'm going to follow my own advice this time and go along the back of the rabbit now. So I'm going to try and avoid this patch that's still wet, although I'm, itching to do it. Of course, you always want to paint the parts that are still wet. That's the way this goes. There we are. So when I'm talking about this kind of rabbit, this is actually, when I drew it, it was really meant to be more of a hare than a rabbit. That's H-A-R-E, not H-A-I-R, right, obviously. So hares are bigger and sort of longer and leaner and more wild and just much nicer than a cute rabbit. I mean, pet rabbits are awesome, but they're awesome in real life. I'm not so fond of drawing them. I want my animals to have some oomph, some attitude. So this was meant really to be a hare more than a rabbit. Oof, it's very black. So you can see I can blend that black in there. It's actually Paynes Grey, but it's kind of black. I can blend it in there and just get it really nicely situated. And I can actually even add a little bit of brown to it to tone that down. I'm not sure that I need it, because I can also tone it down just by adding more brown to the legs, right? Get rid of that line in there. I don't need that at all. Now, I'm using a really good artist quality watercolor paint. So that means that the quality of the paint and the binder in the paint allows me to actually erase these lines afterwards with a really soft foam eraser. There's certain erasers that are softer than others. There's another white one that looks similar to this, but it's a little bit harder. But you actually want the really super soft ones. And you can go right over top of the lines if you're using a good enough quality paint. It's a good indication of whether or not your paint is good enough. whether or not you can erase without erasing everything on it. Okay, you'll see I've left a little bit of a line up in here. I'm just going to go back because I've gotten that quite wet. And I'm just going to finish painting this leg a little bit more. And then I'm going to go back here and just take away that line. There we go. I know I've got more of the belly in here that I haven't painted yet too, but that's going to be a really light color. Whereas up here, I'm going to make it much darker. Okay, and I'll see if I can get along that ruff now. Whenever I'm painting, I'm trying as much as I can to follow the line of the paint. So I don't necessarily want to paint back and forth on this ruff because it might take away some of the movement of the paint, or it might change some of the shape of the paint. So I try and avoid that if I can. Now I've gotten up to this bit here, and you can actually go over it with a fairly light brush quickly, and it won't pick that paint back up again. So you can still see the little roughness of the fur there. Okay. Not gonna put in too much detail just yet. Trying to be good and letting it dry first, right? Yeah, it doesn't always work. Now I want to just make sure that that top of that leg is quite differentiated. So I'm adding a little bit more color to it. Again, we'll go with the grays, and that kind of gives you the side piece, shows you that that side is more gray and this side is less gray. Just the way that the hair on the rabbit goes. More than, if you're thinking it's a lighting issue, at the moment it's not really. I'm not really painting much with light. I'm actually painting this as a fairly either universally lit or a flat animal. Flat color, I should say, not flat animal. Obviously it's a round animal. But I'm not going for particular amounts of realism here either. I don't really mind. I want a nice rabbit. I don't necessarily want a rabbit that's going to look like it's jumped out of the pages of National Geographic, because obviously it's a stylized form in the first place. So I have to really keep in mind what it is that I want to do with the painting as I'm going along, so that I'm not distracted by, for example, trying to get really realistic details into it, right? If I spend all my time getting really realistic details into this rabbit, it's going to lose a lot of what it has. Now this paint is dried a little bit here, and you can see that first pull with a kind of a wet brush didn't really do very much. So I have to go in and scrub away some of those hard lines. I want to get rid of that hard edge on there. There we go, that's better. And again, I'm going to go back and throw in a little bit of gray. I forgot to get a paper out for my blotting before I started. So I'm blotting on my hand. There we go. And not to forget that last little bit of his belly there. There we go. There. Okay. Just going to take a little bit of that off because I don't want it to be quite so dark. There we are. All right. I like that. That looks pretty good. I haven't been able to see the bottom part of that at all. Nice. Now the tail on a hare or a cottontail is the tail is kind of white on the bottom. So I'm going to add the tail like this. It's hard just to leave it white, because then you either have to fill in the background really, really well, and then you can leave it white. That's easy enough. Or I suppose you could paint with white paint, but if you're talking to a watercolor artist, we're like, oh, you can't paint with white paint. That's cheating. So what you have to do is you have to find ways of just suggesting the white part. So in this case, I'm just going to throw in a little bit of color around here. And that gives it a bit of texture, but actually emphasizes the white when you put a lot of color around the outside of it. All right, so that's the basic rabbit. Now I'm gonna go in and add some details. So I'm gonna get some fur on here, a little bit of fuzz. Doing this part always reminds me of my friend Annie. She likes to come and do watercolor classes here. And when she does them, she likes to do a lot of very meticulous hair coloring, which I appreciate. She's made a couple of my watercolor rabbits now. She comes, I have a Thursday afternoon art class that's filled with people who like to experiment. We do a lot of different things in. There we are. Just a bit of a suggestion. Okay. Before I do anything else on there, I'm going to go through and put some, I'm going to try this gold. Now, this has mica in it, so unlike the rest of the paint, which have very, very fine pigment that you can't really see, the mica pigments is what catches the light and makes it sparkle and shine. So this paint here, you'll notice, takes a little bit more activation than these paints. You have to just spend a bit of time. And I don't want this paint to go all the way up into the brush that much. I want it to be quite on the tip. So I'm being careful just to rub it in with the tip there. And that's going to be my eyeball, or the iris rather. I made the whites of the eyes a bit too big for this one. There's the iris. And this, but the mica behaves, how do I explain this? It has like a water well. It holds the surface tension much better. Than other paint. So you can really kind of load the paint on and it's still just fine. It's also a bit more covering. It's more opaque than other paint is. All right. Now, while I'm waiting for that to dry, because that's going to take a little while, I'm going to go through and I'm going to take down a little bit of this. I think this eye is a bit too big for my taste. Give it a bit more hair around here, and just take down this circle. Give some direction to those little hairs all over the face. This is one very fat-faced rabbit. There we are. Fat-faced rabbit. There. That looks pretty good. And then I'll just repeat that on the other side. I'm using very strong pigment at the moment, so there's very little water in it. Lots of pigment. As I said, this is a palette that I prepared for another painting, but I'm trying to see, when you're painting with watercolor, you actually don't use very many colors generally. When you're painting anything, you don't really use very many colors, but I think with oil and acrylic, you use a little bit more just because it's harder to, it doesn't mix as well. Watercolor mixes the best. Or mixing is not right, the matches the best, I guess. And you can do so much with the different levels of paint. With watercolor, you use the amount of paint added is a huge part of the actual painting itself. Oh, he's looking fabulous. So you control the tone and the intensity of the color in order to control the general look of the painting. And that's where a lot of the skill comes in. And it's very frustrating when you first start, especially. So on here, I'm actually going to make some dots. And these are for the start of whiskers. I'm going to give them gold whiskers because I can. And some fur down here in black. texture down on the back here. I don't want the lines to be too regular or all in a row because that's really eye-catching when they are. So you want them to be very kind of random. And that allows your eye to slide past them and go, oh yes, fur texture, but without going, oh, wow. I wonder how, you know, he combed his hair that well that day. So a lot of detail in one spot and then maybe a little bit of fade out. Maybe we'll give him some claws on here. Some big hairy paws. There we are. I like how the tails worked out. That's looking nice. But I think maybe a little bit more color on that nose would also be good. Oh, nice bright pink nose. So I can do something with watercolor like this, where I can put that color really intensely there in the bottom. And then I can go back with some fresh water, clean the brush out, and I can just pull that color out and take down the whole thing a bit. And it becomes not quite as bright and shiny. And I can put some of that up here. So watercolor is quite movable for quite a long time after you put it on. All right. A little bit more of that brown activated. So I want to make sure this eye ridge here is nice and strong. Like I said, I like my characters to have a little bit of attitude there. And that gold is fairly dry now. I'm gonna go in with a very dry brush, get a little bit of that Paynes Grey on there, and just color the eye in. There, that's better. Perfect. Maybe I'll go even around here. Is my hand steady enough for that? Hard. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Now I'll go in with a bit of water, back into that gold again. I'm going to spend a bit of time activating it. This is my favorite of the HKcolourlab gold. It's very robust. You can see she's given me a very generous dollop of it. And I'm going to go from those lines that I made and give myself some whiskers. Now I know filming, blah, 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 but I need to move my paper around because otherwise I'm going to get a different shape than I would get if I paint it properly in the right direction. And that's the shape I want. And you have to remember always that you're the one in control, so you're the one who has to make those kinds of decisions. There we go. I'll give him a little bit of gold up here at the top. And a little bit around here. I think this, if you paint the whole thing in gold, it can be very nice too, but I really like a few just little tiny gold highlights here and there. Just a little tiny bit of sparkle on it. And that means that all the sparkle shines a little bit more. Okay, and there we go. Watercolor rabbit.